Keep your eyes down. Omega, no one here wants to see your face. The words slid through the hall like a blade made of silk, soft in tone but sharp enough to cut, and Lena Whitmore obeyed, lowering her gaze to the polished stone floor that reflected 100 flickering torches above her head, each flame trembling in the breath of wolves far more powerful than she would ever be allowed to become. The air thick with pine smoke, and something deeper, something instinctive, a quiet pressure that settled against her ribs and made every inhale feel borrowed rather than owned, because tonight was the mating ceremony. And in this hall, power wasn't just seen. It was felt in the way conversations hushed when certain figures moved, in the way shoulders straightened without command, in the way no one dared stand in the center unless they had the right to claim it. And Lena had no such right. She moved along the edges instead, a shadow in a simple gray dress that marked her position more clearly than any brand, her steps careful, measured, silent across the cold stone as she carried a silver tray balanced between both hands, glasses trembling slightly with each step, not because of their weight, but because of the eyes that followed her, not with interest, not with kindness, but with that familiar blend of dismissal and amusement that came so easily to those who had never known what it meant to be overlooked entirely. Careful, someone muttered as she passed, though the tone held no concern, only warning wrapped in mockery, and Lena inclined her head just enough to acknowledge it, her throat tight, but her expression still, because she had learned long ago that survival in rooms like this meant becoming smaller than the space allowed, quieter than the silence between breaths, invisible enough that no one thought to push her aside simply to prove they could, yet never so absent that she could be accused of neglecting her duty, a delicate balance she walked every single day, and tonight, under the full weight of ceremony, it felt thinner than ever, the sound of music rising at the far end of the hall, low strings and steady rhythm marking the beginning of something she would never be part of, only witness from the margins. As a pair of high-ranking wolves stepped forward into the torchlight, their presence shifting the atmosphere like a storm rolling across open land, conversations dimming, attention tightening, and Lena adjusted her grip on the tray as she moved closer, because this was where she was needed, where her role, silent, obedient, unnoticed, became necessary for others to shine. She stopped at the edge of the gathering, lowering herself just slightly, not quite kneeling but close enough to show submission, and extended the tray without raising her eyes. Waiting, always waiting, for someone to take what she offered without ever truly seeing the one who held it. A hand reached out, strong, adorned with a ring that caught the firelight, lifting a glass without a word, and Lena held steady until it was gone, until the weight shifted and she could move again, step back, breathe, exist just a little more freely, but not for long, because a second later, a different hand brushed the tray too sharply, tipping one of the glasses just enough that dark red liquid sloshed over the rim and spilled across her fingers, cold at first, then sticky as it ran down her skin, and laughter followed, light, careless, echoing off stone walls that had seen centuries of the same quiet humiliations dressed in ceremony and tradition. Clumsy, someone said, not loudly, but loud enough. And Lena felt the words settle into her like it always did, familiar, expected, almost comforting in its predictability. She didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't even flinch as she shifted the tray to one hand and used the edge of her sleeve to wipe the spill away. The fabric already worn thin from use, now stained darker where the liquid soaked in, another mark, another reminder, and still she said nothing, because nothing was safer. Nothing kept the night moving forward instead of stopping with her at its center, and that was the last place she could afford to be, so she straightened just enough to continue, stepping away from the circle of power, back into the shifting shadows along the hall's edge, her pulse steadying with each step even as something deeper inside her tightened, not from fear alone, but from the quiet, stubborn refusal to let this moment define her entirely. Not tonight, not again. So she lowered her gaze once more, adjusted the tray in her hands, and kept moving, because surviving the night was still within reach, and that, for Lena Whitmore, had always been enough. The tray felt heavier now, not because of the glass or the remaining wine, but because every step Lena Whitmore took seemed to echo louder than before, as if the room itself had decided to notice her just enough to remind her of her place without ever granting her presence any true weight, and she moved carefully along the perimeter, keeping a measured distance from the center where the chosen wolves gathered beneath the tallest torches, their voices low but confident, their laughter unrestrained in a way that only those born into certainty could afford, while she remained just outside that invisible boundary, close enough to serve, far enough to never belong. And the scent in the air shifted again, richer now, layered with something sharper, something that carried authority without needing to announce it, making the fine hairs along her arms lift despite the warmth of the hall. But no one spoke of it, not yet, because attention was still fixed on the ceremony itself, on alliances forming and futures being quietly decided in glances and subtle nods. And Lena lowered herself slightly beside a long table lined with silver pitchers, refilling the glasses that had already been drained, her movements precise, practiced, almost mechanical in their consistency. Yet beneath that calm exterior her awareness stretched thin in every direction, tracking the rhythm of the room, the shifting weight of presence, the way certain conversations dimmed when others passed too close, the way a single misstep here could ripple outward into consequences she could not afford. And so she focused on the simple tasks: pour, step back, breathe, repeat, until a sudden cough broke through the layered sounds, sharp enough to draw her attention despite herself. And she glanced up just enough to see a young beta near the edge of the central gathering, his posture stiff, one hand pressed lightly against his throat as if something had caught, his expression tight, controlled, trying not to draw notice, because drawing notice meant weakness, and weakness in this room was a currency no one wanted to spend. And Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second, the memory of countless warnings echoing through her mind. Do not interfere, do not step forward, do not assume a role that is not yours. Yet the way his shoulders tensed, the subtle strain in his breathing, the way those nearest him pretended not to see, it all pressed against something deeper within her, something that had never quite learned how to remain still when someone needed help. And before she could stop herself, she shifted the tray to the table and stepped forward, closing the distance with quiet urgency that contrasted sharply with the stillness she had maintained all night, her voice low as she reached him. You need to slow your breathing, she said, not loud enough to carry, but steady enough to reach him. And his eyes flicked toward her, surprised, uncertain, as if unsure whether he was allowed to respond. And around them the subtle tension tightened, a few nearby glances turning sharper, more focused, because an Omega had stepped beyond her assigned line, and that alone was enough to disrupt the careful order of the evening. I am fine, he managed, though the strain in his voice betrayed him, and Lena did not argue, did not challenge. She simply lifted a nearby glass of water instead of wine and held it out, her hand steady despite the weight of attention beginning to gather. Then prove it, she murmured, and for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of reluctant trust, and he took the glass, sipping slowly as she had instructed, her gaze remaining lowered out of respect even as her focus stayed entirely on him, counting the rhythm of his breaths, the gradual easing of tension in his shoulders, until the tightness in the air around him began to loosen, just enough to pass unnoticed if no one chose to make it otherwise. But someone always did, and a voice cut through the moment, smooth and edged with quiet authority. Since when does a servant decide who requires her attention? And Lena felt the words before she fully heard them, felt the shift in the room as attention sharpened, as curiosity turned into scrutiny, and she lowered her hand immediately, stepping back the exact distance expected of her, her heart steady even as the weight of consequence settled in, because she already knew the night had just changed, and not in her favor. The words settled over the space like a quiet command, not raised, not harsh, yet impossible to ignore, and Lena Whitmore did not need to look up to know who had spoken, because the shift in the air said enough, the subtle tightening of posture from those nearby, the way conversations softened rather than stopped, as if the room itself adjusted to accommodate the presence behind that voice, and she lowered her gaze further, stepping back with careful precision until her heels met the edge of the stone border that marked where she belonged, her hands folding lightly in front of her to show compliance without hesitation, because hesitation would be read as defiance, and defiance was something she had learned to avoid long before she ever stepped into this hall. "I asked you something." The voice continued, still calm, still controlled, but now directed entirely at her, and Lena felt the attention gather more fully, like a slow turning of heads that did not need to be seen to be understood, and she drew in a measured breath before answering, keeping her tone even, respectful. "He appeared to be in discomfort, sir," she said, choosing each word with care, not claiming authority, not assigning fault, only stating what she had observed, and for a moment, there was no immediate reply, only the faint crackle of torchlight and the distant continuation of music that now felt strangely out of place against the quiet tension forming in this small corner of the hall. "And you believed it was your place to intervene," the voice said at last, and this time there was something beneath it, not anger, not quite, but a testing edge, as if weighing her answer before it was even given, and Lena remained still, her heartbeat steady despite the awareness that every response carried weight beyond its words. "No, sir," she answered softly, "but I believed it was better than doing nothing," and a subtle ripple passed through the nearby wolves at that, not loud enough to be called reaction, but present enough to be felt, because Omegas did not speak in such terms here. They did not justify actions that stepped outside their assigned role, and Lena knew that, knew exactly how her words might be received, yet she did not retract them, did not soften them further, because they were the truth, and the truth, once spoken, could not be reshaped without losing something essential. "Interesting," the voice replied, quieter now, almost thoughtful, and Lena sensed movement, a shift in position that brought that presence closer without needing to see it. The faintest change in scent reaching her, something colder, sharper, like winter air before the first snowfall, and it made her lungs tighten just slightly, not from fear, but from something she could not quite name, something that did not fit within the simple category she had built to understand the world around her. "Most in this room would have chosen to look away," he continued. "It is safer that way." And there was no accusation in the statement, only observation, yet it carried more weight than any reprimand could have, because it spoke to a truth she had lived with for years, that safety often meant silence, and silence often meant allowing things to remain as they were, and Lena lowered her head a fraction more, acknowledging the point without agreeing or disagreeing, because either response would shift the balance further than she intended. "Return to your duties," he said after a brief pause, the authority in his tone now unmistakable, final without needing emphasis, and Lena inclined her head immediately, stepping back with the same controlled grace she had maintained all evening, her movements smooth, deliberate, as if the moment had not unsettled her at all, as if she had not just drawn the attention of someone whose presence alone altered the atmosphere of the entire hall. And as she retrieved her tray from the table, her fingers brushing briefly against the cool metal, she felt the faintest tremor pass through her hand before she steadied it, adjusting her grip and turning once more toward the edge of the gathering, resuming her path along the perimeter. Yet something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, because now the silence that followed her steps felt different, not empty, not dismissive, but aware, as if the room itself had marked her in some quiet, unspoken way, and Lena kept her gaze down, her pace even, her role unchanged, because whatever had just occurred, whatever attention had briefly found her, it could not be allowed to alter the one thing she depended on most, remaining unnoticed for the rest of the night, even as somewhere behind her, that presence remained, and whether he watched or not, she could not tell, only that the air had not yet returned to what it had been before. The rhythm of the ceremony resumed as if nothing had happened, music rising again to fill the space where tension had briefly taken hold, and Lena Whitmore moved with it, slipping back into the quiet pattern of service that had defined her place long before this night began, her steps measured across the stone floor, her hands steady as she lifted and replaced glasses, yet the awareness she carried now refused to fade. It lingered beneath every movement like a second pulse, subtle but persistent, because something had shifted, not in the hall, not in the ceremony, but in the way the air seemed to respond around her, as if the space she occupied had been marked in a way she could not see, only feel, and she kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the simple tasks that had always kept her anchored, counting each breath, each step, each small action that required no thought beyond execution. Because thinking too much in a place like this led to mistakes, and mistakes were never forgotten, especially not when they came from someone like her. Yet even as she worked, the edges of conversation reached her, quiet enough to avoid direct confrontation, but sharp enough to carry meaning. "Did you see that?" one voice murmured behind a raised hand. She spoke as if she belonged. Another replied with a soft, incredulous laugh. They forget their place so easily, and Lena did not react, did not pause, did not allow those words to alter her pace, because she had heard variations of them her entire life, had learned to let them pass through her without leaving a mark. Yet tonight they felt different, not louder, not harsher, but closer, as if the attention they carried was more focused, more deliberate, and that alone made them harder to ignore. And as she approached the long table once more, reaching for a fresh pitcher, a figure stepped into her path, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with a certainty that made it clear he expected her to stop, and she did, immediately, lowering her head in acknowledgement as she waited, because waiting was always safer than moving forward uninvited. "You seem to have forgotten the rules," the man said, his tone smooth, almost conversational, yet layered with something that made the space around them feel narrower, more confined. And Lena recognized the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "No, sir," she replied quietly, her voice even, respectful. "I remember them clearly." And there was a brief pause, as if her answer had not aligned with his expectation. "Then explain why you chose to ignore them," he continued, tilting his head slightly, studying her without the courtesy of lowering his gaze. And Lena remained still, her hands steady around the tray, her posture unchanged, because any visible reaction would only confirm what he was already suggesting. "I did not ignore them," she said after a moment. "I made a choice." And the distinction hung in the air between them, subtle but significant, and for a second, the surrounding noise seemed to dim again, not entirely, but enough that the shift could be felt, and the man's expression tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to irritation, as if he had expected compliance and instead found resistance wrapped carefully in respect. "A choice," he repeated, softer now, almost amused. "That is not a privilege granted to you." And Lena inclined her head again, acknowledging the truth in his words without conceding her position, because she understood exactly what he meant, understood that in this world, her choices were expected to align perfectly with the expectations placed upon her, and anything beyond that was seen as overstepping. Yet she did not apologize, did not retract, because the moment had already passed, the action already taken, and there was no benefit in reshaping it now. "Be careful," he added after a brief silence, his tone shifting just enough to carry warning rather than commentary. "Attention can be a dangerous thing when it falls in the wrong direction." And Lena felt the weight of that statement settle more heavily than anything he had said before, because it was not just a remark, it was a reminder that being noticed in a place like this did not always lead to opportunity. More often it led to scrutiny, and scrutiny had a way of exposing even the smallest misstep until it became something far larger, something impossible to ignore, and she lowered her gaze further in acknowledgement, stepping to the side as he moved past her without another word, his presence fading back into the broader flow of the hall, yet leaving behind a quiet tension that lingered longer than his footsteps. And Lena remained still for a brief moment, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the tray before she forced them to relax, drawing in a slow, steady breath as she resumed her path once more, because whatever attention had found her tonight, whether brief or lasting, she could not allow it to change the one thing that mattered most, surviving until the ceremony ended, even if the room no longer felt as forgiving as it had before. The ceremony moved forward with a steady, almost ceremonial inevitability, as if nothing in the room could truly disrupt its course. Yet for Lena Whitmore, every second now felt sharper, more defined, each movement carrying the quiet awareness that she was no longer entirely invisible, and that awareness settled into her like a weight she could not set down, no matter how carefully she adjusted her steps, her breathing, her posture, because once attention had found her, even briefly, it had a way of lingering in the edges of perception, in the glances that lasted half a second longer than before, in the pauses that formed when she passed too close. And she felt it now in the way the space around her did not fully close after she moved through it, as if something remained behind, something that marked her presence in a way she had never intended, and she kept her focus anchored to the tray in her hands, to the cool surface of the glasses, to the simple, grounding repetition of her task, because anything beyond that threatened to pull her into a current she could not control, and control was the only thing that had ever kept her safe. But even that felt thinner now, stretched by the events that had already unfolded. And as she reached the far side of the hall, where the shadows deepened and the torches cast longer, softer light, she allowed herself a single, steady breath, a moment to gather the fragments of composure that had begun to shift, and it was there, in that quieter corner, that the sound reached her, not loud, not abrupt, but wrong in its timing, a subtle falter in the rhythm of the room, like a note slightly out of place in an otherwise perfect melody, and she turned her head just enough to see the source, a cluster of wolves near one of the supporting pillars, their attention fixed inward, their posture tight in a way that suggested something was not unfolding as expected, and Lena felt that familiar pull again, that instinct that did not align with the rules she had been taught, the one that noticed discomfort before it was spoken, imbalance before it was acknowledged. And she hesitated, only for a moment, because hesitation had become her habit, her shield against stepping too far beyond what was permitted. Yet the tension in that small group did not ease, it deepened, and she saw the way one of them shifted, his stance unsteady for just a fraction of a second, quickly corrected, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough to escape her notice, and she knew, without needing explanation, that something was wrong, something that others were choosing not to address. Because addressing it would mean acknowledging weakness in a place where weakness was never tolerated, and Lena closed her eyes briefly, not in surrender, but in decision, because this was the moment where she could choose to remain exactly what she had always been, silent, compliant, untouched by consequence, or she could step forward again, knowing full well what that would invite, and the memory of the earlier warning echoed in her mind. Attention can be a dangerous thing, yet alongside it came another truth, quieter but stronger, that doing nothing carried its own cost, one that lingered long after the moment had passed. And when she opened her eyes again, the choice had already been made, not through defiance, not through rebellion, but through something simpler, something she had never been able to silence, and she shifted her path, moving toward the cluster with the same careful precision she had used all night, her steps measured, her presence unobtrusive, yet deliberate enough to close the distance without drawing immediate notice. And as she reached the edge of the group, she lowered her gaze once more, keeping her posture respectful, controlled, even as her attention focused entirely on the one who had faltered. "Take a slower breath," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet steady enough to reach him. And for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single interaction, the surrounding noise dimming just enough to make space for it. And the wolf's eyes flickered toward her, surprise clear even in that fraction of a second, because this was not how the evening was meant to unfold. Not for her, not for anyone like her, and Lena held her position, not pressing, not retreating, simply present, offering the same quiet guidance she had before, even as she felt the shift begin again, that subtle tightening in the air that signaled attention returning, gathering, focusing, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that whatever followed this moment would not pass as easily as the last, because the room had already begun to remember her, and remembering had a way of changing everything. The moment stretched just long enough to be noticed, not by everyone, not yet, but by those closest, by those who understood how tightly controlled a night like this was meant to be, and Lena Whitmore felt it in the way the small circle around her shifted, shoulders angling slightly, attention sharpening without a word being spoken, because an Omega stepping forward once could be dismissed as an accident, but twice became something else entirely, something harder to ignore, and she kept her gaze lowered, her voice quiet, steady as she spoke again. "Slow, steady breaths, do not fight it." Her tone calm, almost instinctive, as if she had said these words 100 times before in places far less watchful than this. And the wolf in front of her hesitated, his chest rising unevenly before he forced himself to follow her guidance. And for a brief moment, the tension in his posture eased, just enough to be seen by those paying attention, just enough to confirm that what she was doing was working. And that was when the shift came, not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable, a silence that moved through the hall like a ripple across still water, subtle at first, then widening, drawing awareness with it until even those at the far edges felt it without knowing why. And Lena felt it too, the change in the air, the way it grew heavier, colder, not in temperature but in presence, as if something larger had just stepped into the space and claimed it without needing permission, and she did not need to look to know who had arrived, because the room itself reacted before any voice could confirm it. Conversation softened, laughter faded, posture straightened, and an invisible line seemed to form down the center of the hall, dividing what had been from what was now. And Lena's breath caught for a fraction of a second before she steadied it, forcing her focus back to the wolf in front of her, because stopping now would only draw more attention, and attention was already gathering faster than she could avoid it. "That is it," she murmured, barely audible. Just like that. And his breathing began to even out, the strain leaving his shoulders in slow increments, until finally he straightened fully, no longer drawing notice for the wrong reasons. And for a heartbeat, Lena allowed herself to believe the moment might pass, that she might step back once more into the quiet edges of the hall and disappear again into the role she understood. But the silence did not break. It held, stretched, deepened, and then came the sound of footsteps, measured, unhurried, each one carrying a weight that seemed to press against the stone itself. And Lena felt it before she heard it, felt the presence moving closer, felt the way the air shifted with each step, and the instinct to step back rose immediately, sharp and urgent. But she held her ground just long enough to complete what she had started, lowering her hand slightly as the wolf gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his expression steadier now, his composure restored, and only then did she begin to move, stepping back into the space she was meant to occupy, her head lowered, her posture composed, as if she had never stepped forward at all, as if she had never drawn the attention that now surrounded her. And the footsteps stopped just short of where she stood, close enough that she could feel the presence fully now, unmistakable, undeniable. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was expectant, charged with something that made the air feel thinner, harder to breathe. And for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, as if the entire hall waited for a single word to define what would happen next. And Lena kept her gaze fixed downward, her hands still, her breathing controlled, because there was nothing else she could do, nothing else she could offer except the same quiet composure that had carried her this far. Yet even as she stood there, she knew, with a clarity that settled deep in her chest, that whatever came next would not allow her to return to the shadows as easily as before, because this time, the attention had not just found her, it had stopped, and it was waiting. No one announced him, no herald spoke his name, and yet the entire hall seemed to recognize his presence before a single word was said, because power like his did not require introduction. It reshaped the air simply by existing within it. And Lena Whitmore felt that shift settle over her like a weight she could neither escape nor ignore, her breath slowing on instinct, her posture still, every sense sharpening despite her lowered gaze, because even without looking she knew exactly who stood before her now, the one presence every wolf in this room measured themselves against, the one name that carried authority beyond rank or ritual. And the silence that followed his arrival was not uncertain, it was absolute, as if the room itself had paused to wait for his judgment. And Lena held her position, her hands steady at her sides, her head inclined just enough to show respect without drawing attention, because drawing attention now would not be something she could step away from. Not this time, not with him standing so close that she could feel the quiet intensity of it, the way it pressed against her awareness without force, without demand, and yet completely undeniable. And for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, nothing happened. No voice broke the silence. No movement disrupted the stillness. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying easily through the quiet without ever needing to rise. "Look at me." And the words were not harsh, not sharp, yet they held a weight that made refusal impossible, and Lena's breath caught just slightly before she obeyed, lifting her gaze slowly, carefully, as if the motion itself required permission, and when her eyes met his, the world seemed to narrow in a way she had never experienced before, not because of fear, though there was some of that, but because of the clarity in that moment, the way everything else in the hall seemed to fall away, leaving only the space between them. And Cale Thornridge regarded her with an expression that revealed nothing and everything at once, his gaze steady, assessing, not dismissive, not amused, but focused in a way that made it impossible to pretend she was invisible. And Lena felt that realization settle deep, because she had spent her entire life being overlooked, moving through rooms without leaving an impression, and now, for the first time, she was being seen, truly seen, and she did not know what to do with that. So she held still, her expression composed, her breathing controlled, waiting, because waiting was all she had ever known how to do in moments like this. "You stepped forward," he said after a brief silence. Not a question, not an accusation, simply a statement, and Lena inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, because denying it would serve no purpose. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the weight of his attention, and something in his expression shifted, subtle enough that most would not have noticed, but she did, because she was looking directly at him, because she could not look away. "Twice," he continued, and again, not a question, not a challenge, just fact. And Lena felt the quiet tightening of the room around them, the awareness of every other wolf present pressing in from the edges, waiting, watching, because whatever happened next would not remain contained to this small space. It would ripple outward, shaping the rest of the night, and she understood that, understood the importance of every word, every breath, every movement, and still, when she spoke, she did not change her answer. "Yes, sir," she said again, and for a moment, nothing followed, the silence stretching just enough to make the weight of it felt. And then, slowly, deliberately, Cale took a step closer, closing the remaining distance between them until the space felt smaller, more defined, and Lena's heartbeat steadied rather than quickened, because something in his presence, despite its intensity, did not carry the same edge of dismissal she had grown used to. It carried something else, something she could not yet name, and he studied her for another brief moment before speaking again, his voice quieter now, meant only for her despite the silence around them. "Why?" And the single word held more weight than any longer question could have, because it asked for truth, not explanation, and Lena felt that truth rise before she could shape it, before she could soften it into something safer, because no one else would. She answered, her voice just as quiet, just as steady, and the words settled between them, simple, unadorned, undeniable, and for the first time since he had spoken, something in Cale Thornridge's gaze shifted in a way that could not be mistaken, not softened, not dismissed, something that marked the moment as more than it had been before, and Lena knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that this night had already changed, and there was no returning to what it had been before. The answer lingered in the air between them, simple in its wording yet impossible to dismiss, and Lena Whitmore felt the weight of it settle not only in the space she occupied, but in the silence that stretched outward across the hall, because even those who could not hear her words could sense the shift, the way something unspoken had just altered the balance of the moment, and Cale Thornridge did not look away, did not respond immediately, his gaze holding steady on hers, as if measuring not just what she had said, but what it revealed beneath the surface. And for Lena, that stillness was more unsettling than any reprimand could have been, because she did not know how to navigate it, did not know how to retreat from it without breaking the fragile composure she had maintained. And so she remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, meeting his gaze without challenge yet without shrinking from it, because something in her refused to retreat now that she had stepped this far, even if every instinct she had ever learned told her that this was the moment to lower her eyes, to disappear back into the edges of the room where she had always been safe. Yet safety felt different now, distant in a way she could not quite explain, and the silence stretched just long enough for the rest of the hall to begin shifting again, whispers rising at the edges, quiet but persistent. Like wind moving through tall grass, she answered him. Someone murmured, disbelief threading through the words. She looked at him. Another added, softer, more uncertain, because what was happening did not fit within the expectations of this ceremony, of this world, and Lena felt that awareness press in from all sides, the knowledge that every eye, whether openly or in secret, was now fixed on her in a way that could not be undone, and still, Cale did not break that moment, did not turn away, until finally, slowly, he shifted his gaze, not dismissing her, not releasing her entirely, but expanding his attention outward, acknowledging the room that had begun to stir under the weight of what they had just witnessed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried further this time, not raised, but clear enough to reach beyond the small space they occupied. The ceremony continues, he said, the authority in his tone immediate and absolute, and the hall responded as if released from a held breath, movement returning, conversations resuming, though quieter now, more cautious, because something had changed and no one yet understood what it meant, and Lena felt that shift as well, the way the tension eased just enough to allow motion, yet did not fully disappear, lingering like a question that had not yet been answered, and she lowered her gaze at last, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of the moment passing, her hands returning to the familiar position at her sides as she stepped back, one measured step at a time, creating distance between herself and the center of attention that had formed around her, and for a brief moment, she believed that would be enough, that the night would resume its course, and she would be allowed to fade once more into the quiet rhythm of her duties. But as she turned, reaching for the tray she had set aside, she felt it again, that awareness, sharper now, more defined, not from the crowd, but from him, and though he had shifted his attention outward, though his presence now addressed the room as a whole, something of it remained fixed on her, subtle yet unmistakable, like a thread that had been drawn between them without her consent, without her understanding, and she steadied her hands as she lifted the tray once more, forcing her focus back to the simple, grounding actions that had always carried her through moments of uncertainty. Yet even as she moved, even as she resumed her role along the edges of the hall, she knew that nothing about this night could return to what it had been before, because she had been seen, not in passing, not in dismissal, but in a way that had altered the very space she occupied, and whether that would become something she could survive or something that would undo her entirely, she could not yet tell, only that the path forward had shifted, and there was no stepping back from it now. The music resumed its steady cadence, filling the hall once more with a sense of order that felt almost forced now, as if the ceremony itself was trying to reclaim control over something it could no longer fully contain. And Lena Whitmore moved with that rhythm, her steps measured, her posture composed, her hands steady as she continued her duties along the outer edge. Yet every movement carried an awareness that had not been there before, a quiet tension beneath the surface that refused to fade no matter how carefully she focused on the simple tasks in front of her, because the memory of his gaze lingered, not as a fleeting moment, but as something anchored, something that had settled into her awareness and refused to be ignored. And she could feel it even now, the subtle pull of attention that did not belong to the crowd, did not belong to the whispers or the glances that followed her, but to him. And though he no longer stood directly before her, though his presence now commanded the center of the hall as the ceremony continued, something of that connection remained, intangible yet undeniable, and Lena lowered her gaze further as she passed a group of higher-ranking wolves, offering the tray without pause, her movements smooth, practiced, yet she could feel the difference in the way they accepted it now, the brief hesitation, the flicker of something unreadable in their expressions, as if they were reassessing what they had already decided about her, and that alone was enough to unsettle the fragile balance she had maintained all night, because being reassessed meant being seen again, and being seen too often in a place like this rarely ended well, and she shifted her path slightly, keeping closer to the shadows where the torchlight softened and the edges of the hall offered some illusion of distance, even if it was only temporary, and for a few moments, it worked, the noise of the ceremony rising just enough to obscure her presence, the attention of the room, redirecting toward the unfolding pairings and quiet negotiations that defined the purpose of the night. And Lena allowed herself to breathe more evenly, to settle back into the familiar rhythm she had relied on for years. But the reprieve did not last, because as she reached the far side of the hall once more, a voice called out, not loudly, but clearly enough to cut through the surrounding sound. "You." And Lena stopped immediately, the single word enough to anchor her in place, her body stilling before she even fully registered the direction it had come from. And she turned slowly, carefully, her gaze remaining lowered as she faced the speaker, and there was no mistaking the intent behind the attention now. No subtlety, no quiet observation. This was deliberate, direct, and the wolves nearby shifted slightly to make space, not out of courtesy, but out of expectation, because something was about to unfold, something that would not remain contained to the edges of the room. And Lena felt that realization settle into her, not as fear, but as a steady awareness that the line she had crossed earlier could not be uncrossed, that whatever protection silence had once offered her had already been broken, and now she stood at the center of something she had never intended to become part of. And the man who had spoken stepped closer, his expression composed yet edged with something sharper than before, something less patient, as if the earlier moments had shifted his perception in a way he did not appreciate. "Come here," he said. The command simple, unadorned, and Lena hesitated for only a fraction of a second before obeying, because refusal was not an option, not here, not now, and she moved forward with the same controlled precision she had maintained all night, each step deliberate, each breath measured, until she stood before him once more, her hands steady at her sides, her gaze lowered in acknowledgement, waiting, because waiting was the only thing left to her in a moment like this. And as the surrounding noise dimmed again, as attention gathered once more, she felt the weight of it, pressing in from all sides, the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not pass unnoticed, and somewhere beyond that circle of attention, beyond the immediate tension of the moment, there was another presence, still, watchful, and though she did not look, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her, that he had not stopped paying attention, not even for a second. The distance between them closed with a quiet inevitability that felt heavier than any force, not because Lena Whitmore moved too slowly, but because every step forward seemed to draw more attention, more silence, more awareness from the room that had already begun to shift around her. And when she finally stopped a few feet away from the man who had called her forward, the air between them felt defined, contained, as if the rest of the hall had receded just enough to leave this moment exposed. And she kept her gaze lowered, her posture composed, her breathing steady, because she understood that whatever was about to happen would not be softened by hesitation. And the man regarded her for a long moment, his expression controlled, yet edged with something sharper than before, something that suggested this was no longer a simple question of curiosity, but of correction, of restoring a balance that had been disturbed. "You seem to misunderstand your position," he said at last, his voice even, yet carrying clearly enough that those nearest could hear without effort. And Lena inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without responding, because responding too quickly would only confirm what he already believed, and silence, for now, was safer. "You were not brought here to intervene," he continued, his tone tightening just enough to reveal the expectation beneath it. "You were brought here to serve." And the words settled between them with deliberate weight, not as an insult, but as a reminder, a boundary drawn in simple terms that left no room for interpretation. And Lena felt the truth of it, not as something new, but as something she had always known, something that had shaped every step she had taken in this world. And still, when she spoke, her voice did not waver. "Yes, sir," she said, because denying it would be meaningless, because acknowledging it did not require surrendering the choice she had made. And for a moment, that answer seemed to satisfy him, or at least confirm what he had expected. But the pause that followed suggested something else, something unfinished, and he stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make the distance between them feel intentional, measured. "Then explain," he said, quieter now, though no less firm, "why you continue to act as though those rules do not apply to you." And the question, though simply phrased, carried a sharper edge than before, because it was no longer about what she had done, but about why she believed she could do it again. And Lena felt the weight of that distinction settle into her, understood the difference between a single misstep and a pattern, and she knew that her answer now would define how this moment moved forward, not just for her, but for how the room would remember it. And she drew in a slow breath before responding, not to buy time, but to ensure that what she said would remain steady, unchanged by the pressure around her. "I do not believe the rules. Do not apply to me," she said, her voice quiet, controlled. "I believe they do." And there was a slight shift in the air at that, a subtle tightening, because the answer did not follow the path expected, did not offer apology or retreat, but something else entirely, and she continued before the silence could turn against her. "But I also believe that choosing to help someone does not erase my place. It only defines who I am within it." And the words settled between them, not raised, not challenged, simply stated. And for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because what she had said did not fit neatly into the structure the room understood, and the man's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that the shift could be felt, his gaze narrowing slightly as he considered her, as if reassessing not just her actions, but the reasoning behind them, and the silence stretched, deeper now, more deliberate, until it was broken by something else entirely, not a voice, not a movement, but a presence that pressed forward without needing permission, and Lena felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift in attention, the way the room seemed to realign around a new center, and then the footsteps came, measured, unmistakable, each one carrying a weight that drew every eye without command, and the man before her stepped back instinctively, not in fear, but in recognition, because there were some presences that did not require explanation, and Lena did not need to look to know that Cale Thornridge had moved again, had stepped into this moment not as an observer, but as something else entirely. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was absolute, waiting for what he would say next. The hall seemed to hold its breath as Cale Thornridge stepped fully into view, and Lena Whitmore could feel the weight of his presence even before her eyes met his again, a pressure that settled over the space like a tide, drawing attention not just to him, but to her as well, and she held her posture, steady, controlled, aware that every subtle movement she made would be noticed, and perhaps judged, by those still watching from the edges. Yet she did not flinch, did not shift backward, because retreat had never solved anything, and the quiet in the room deepened as he paused a step away from her, studying her not with accusation, not with curiosity, but with an intensity that measured both the action and the intent behind it. And Lena felt it, the assessment, the way it pressed without touching, without speaking, like the gravity of someone larger than any fear she had ever known. "Step forward." His voice broke the silence, calm, deliberate, carrying authority that did not need volume, and Lena obeyed, her steps careful, measured, each one placed with attention to balance and poise, moving into the small circle that had formed, the air shifting around her as if even the room acknowledged her motion. And when she stopped a few feet from him, she lowered her gaze just enough to show respect without yielding the composure she had maintained all night. And Cale's eyes did not move from hers, capturing her focus entirely, holding it with a quiet certainty that made the rest of the hall fade into background. "You have done what was expected and more," he said, voice soft now, but not less powerful, carrying an undercurrent that made every word resonate. "And yet you stand here, measured, composed, when most would have faltered under observation." And Lena's pulse responded instinctively, steadying as she absorbed the meaning, understanding the weight behind it, and yet remaining silent, because she knew that words now could either confirm or diminish the moment, and she chose to let the silence speak, letting the space between them carry what she could not say aloud, and the hall held still, every pair of eyes aware that something exceptional had passed, a quiet recognition that required no proclamation, no applause, only attention, and Lena felt it ripple through her, a subtle acknowledgement that she had, in this single act, claimed a presence within the room that had never been offered before, and though the weight of it pressed, it was not threatening, not harsh, but grounding, a certainty that steadied rather than shook. and Kale shifted slightly, stepping closer. The movement deliberate, slowing time in a way that made each heartbeat count, each breath measured. And then he extended a hand, not as a command, not as an expectation, but as an acknowledgement. And Lena looked up, her eyes meeting his with quiet composure, understanding the invitation without hesitation, and she placed her hand lightly in his, feeling the subtle warmth of contact, the weight of it carrying more than physical touch, but a presence that marked her as recognized, acknowledged. And in that instant, the murmurs that had begun to stir along the edges of the hall quieted, the eyes that had tracked her every step softened, and even the music seemed to shift, softer, lower, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. And Lena remained steady, her hand in his, her posture composed, her mind aware of every subtle cue, every breath between them, because this was a moment that would define how the rest of the night unfolded. And Kale did not speak immediately, allowing the acknowledgement to breathe, to fill the space. And in that silence, Lena understood that she had not just survived, she had stepped into recognition, into a presence that could not be ignored. And the hall, the observers, the ceremony itself, all held for that single, sustained instant, before the rhythm of the night continued, but now in a space reshaped by what had just occurred. The hall, though still lit by the warm glow of torches, seemed quieter now, as if the very walls had leaned closer to listen. And Lena Whitmore felt the weight of that attentiveness settle over her, grounding her in a way that was both familiar and new, because she had long been accustomed to moving unseen, to existing at the edge, but now, with her hand in Kale Thornridge's, that edge had disappeared, and she could feel the subtle currents of power and attention ripple through the room, carrying with them a sense of order and anticipation that had not been present before. And she adjusted her posture slightly, standing tall, her shoulders even, her head lifted just enough to meet the very edges of Kale's gaze without challenging it, because to do so would be unnecessary. And beneath the surface, a quiet acknowledgement passed between them, a recognition of composure, of presence, of a decision made in silence. And the observers around them shifted subtly, some stepping back, others leaning in, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and respect, the hall itself holding its breath as if aware that what had begun here could not be unseen. And Lena felt the gravity of that truth settle into her chest, steadying her pulse, guiding her breath, because she understood, more clearly than ever, that each movement, each subtle shift, now carried meaning beyond the ordinary, beyond the simple role she had been assigned. And she kept her hand still in his, neither pressing nor retreating, allowing the moment to exist fully, deliberately, as the quietest of declarations. And Kale's presence beside her remained steady, a constant anchor, radiating a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the anxious attention of the other wolves in the hall. Yet it was not oppressive, it was measured, controlled, and in that measurement, Lena found a new rhythm to match, a subtle harmony that allowed her to breathe without fear, to occupy the space without tension. And the music that had resumed in the background, low strings and soft percussion, seemed to bend around this new focal point, as if it had been designed to highlight, to punctuate, not the ceremony, but the recognition that had just occurred. And Lena moved slightly, not breaking contact, not shifting the dynamic, simply adjusting her stance so that balance returned to her body, while still feeling every whisper of energy in the air, the way attention lingered at the edges of perception, tugging and pressing with subtle insistence, reminding her that she had not returned to invisibility. And she did not intend to, because the moment had been claimed, quietly, irrevocably, by her presence and by the acknowledgement from Kale. And she allowed herself a brief inhale, steady, deliberate, as if drawing in the affirmation from the hall itself, from the watchers, from the light and shadows that stretched across stone walls. And the sense of permanence settled just enough that she could feel it, not in fear, not in apprehension, but in a clarity that sharpened her awareness of everything that remained in front of her, every subtle cue, every motion, every breath that followed. And Kale shifted his weight slightly, a small, deliberate movement, not commanding, not questioning, but enough to indicate attention, focus. And Lena mirrored that shift almost imperceptibly, a silent partnership in posture and presence, as the hall continued its observances, and the music carried on, each note threading through the quiet with gentle insistence, yet unable to diminish the weight of the recognition. And Lena understood, fully, that the moment had expanded beyond the simple parameters of ceremony, into a space of acknowledgement, trust, and presence that had been rare in her life until this point, and she held it, allowed it, without fear, without flinch, steady in body and mind, because she knew that whatever followed would be measured against this instant, and she could now meet it on her own terms, alongside the presence that had chosen to recognize her, in silence, with gravity, and with a quiet permanence that would carry beyond the walls of the hall. The moment did not break, it settled, deep and lasting, as if the hall itself had accepted what could no longer be undone. And Lena Whitmore stood within that stillness with a clarity she had never known before, her hand resting in Cale Thornridge's not as a question, not as a fragile connection that might disappear, but as something acknowledged, something witnessed by every eye in the room. And though the ceremony continued around them, though the music resumed its steady rhythm and the torches continued to flicker against stone, nothing returned to what it had been, because the center had shifted, and with it, the meaning of every movement that followed. And Lena felt that shift not as pressure, not as fear, but as a quiet certainty that anchored her in place, that allowed her to breathe without shrinking, to stand without retreating. And as Cale's presence remained beside her, unwavering, deliberate, she understood that this was not an accident, not a fleeting moment of attention that would pass with the night. This was a choice, made in silence, but carried with absolute clarity, and the wolves, gathered in the hall, understood it as well, even if none dared to speak it aloud. Their posture changed, their attention no longer dismissive, no longer careless, but measured, cautious, as if they now stood within the reach of something that demanded respect. And Lena's gaze moved slowly across the space before her, not searching, not challenging, simply seeing, truly seeing for the first time how the room had transformed, how the distance that once separated her from them had been replaced by something else entirely, something that could not be easily named, but could be felt in every subtle shift of movement, every quiet step taken around her rather than through her. And Cale's hand remained steady, his grip neither tightening nor loosening, but constant, as if reinforcing that this moment was not temporary, not uncertain. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried not just to her, but to the hall itself, calm, unwavering. "She stands where I choose." The words simple, yet absolute, cutting cleanly through any doubt that might have lingered, and the effect was immediate, not in sound, but in presence, in the way every wolf present seemed to still for a fraction of a second, absorbing the meaning, recognizing the authority behind it. And Lena felt the weight of those words settle into her, not as a burden, but as something steadier, something that aligned with the quiet strength she had carried all along, unseen, unrecognized until now. And she did not speak, did not move, because there was nothing to add, nothing to prove. The moment had already spoken for itself. And as the ceremony continued, reshaped but unbroken, Lena remained where she stood, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, but present in a way that could not be reversed. And as the music swelled once more, filling the space with a rhythm that felt different now, deeper, more grounded, she understood that this night would not end as it had begun, that whatever followed would carry the echo of this moment into every future step. And as Cale leaned slightly closer, his voice lowering just enough that only she could hear, steady, certain, he spoke words that settled into her like a promise she had never expected to receive. "You serve them tonight," he said, a quiet pause following, deliberate, meaningful, before the final words. "Now you will never stand unseen again." And Lena Whitmore did not look away, did not lower her gaze, because for the first time, she did not need to.